The scent of ancient dust, baked by 1,000 years of heat, lingers in the still air of the high desert long after the wind has died away. It is a dry, mineral smell, the scent of oxidized iron and pulverized limestone, carrying with it the weight of geological epochs that transcend the brief flicker of human memory. Down within the deep fissures of the Grand Canyon, the shadows do not merely fall, they pool like dark water, filling the labyrinthine side canyons and masking the scars of erosion that have been carved over millions of years. This is a landscape where time is not measured in minutes or hours, but in the slow rhythmic pulse of the earth itself, a place where the stratigraphy, those distinct layers of rock that tell the story of our planet's crust, reveals a timeline that stretches back nearly 2 billion years. To stand at the rim is to peer into the very throat of history, looking down through the great unconformity, a gap in the rock record where hundreds of millions of years simply vanished, leaving behind a silence that is as heavy as the stone. On the evening of the 5th of April, 1909, a different kind of silence was broken. In the dusty offices of the Arizona Gazette, a story was being prepared for the morning edition that would ripple through the collective imagination of a young nation. The headline was bold, claiming to reveal the discovery of a massive underground citadel, an architectural marvel hidden deep within the heart of the canyon. It spoke of a place where the echoes of a forgotten civilization still resonated against the damp cave walls, a site so vast and so alien to the known history of the American West that it defied every established narrative of the time. The article introduced the world to a man named G.E. Kinkaid, an explorer and prospector who claimed to have been traveling alone in a small boat, drifting down the Colorado River in search of mineral wealth, when his eyes caught a glimpse of something impossible. He described seeing a series of man-made indentations high up on a canyon wall, nearly 2,000 feet above the riverbed. Upon climbing the treacherous cliffs, he reportedly found an entrance, a portal leading into a subterranean world that stretched for miles into the dark. Within these tunnels, Kinkaid claimed to have found evidence of a culture that shared more in common with the ancient East than with the indigenous tribes of the Southwest. He spoke of great halls, of granaries filled with seeds that had never been seen in this hemisphere, and of a central shrine where a cross-legged figure sat in eternal meditation. It was a tale of the great unknown, the term used by early 20th century explorers to describe the vast, unmapped stretches of the American interior that still held the promise of mystery. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for the night, perhaps you can imagine the flickering lantern light of those early explorers as they stepped into the cool, quiet dark of the earth. You are here, in the right place, to let the weight of the day drift away. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new history narrations, just like this one every single day, weaving the mysteries of the past into the quiet of the present. If you find this journey into the canyon relaxing, you might consider subscribing so that we can meet here again tomorrow night. A simple like on the video also helps other weary travelers find their way to our quiet corner of the archives. But for now, let us breathe deeply and return to the cool, dark tunnels of 1909. The early 20th century was an era defined by a feverish fascination with exploration. The world was shrinking, yet the gaps in our knowledge were still wide enough to contain entire lost worlds. This was the age of the amateur archaeologist and the rugged adventurer, a time before the widespread use of radiocarbon dating, that scientific process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic materials. In 1909, the stratigraphy of the canyon was understood as a geological marvel, but the human history of the region was still being pieced together from fragments of pottery and the oral traditions of the Hopi and Navajo people. The idea that a Bronze Age civilization, A culture capable of smelting metals and engineering massive underground structures could have existed in the shadows of the Arizona desert was both scandalous and intoxicating. Kinkaid's account, as relayed by the Gazette, was meticulously detailed. He described the main chamber of the Citadel as being shaped like a giant wheel, with tunnels radiating outward like spokes. The walls were allegedly carved with a precision that rivaled the great temples of Egypt or the Indus Valley. He spoke of finding copper tools and gold artifacts, items that suggested a level of metallurgical skill far beyond what was expected of the prehistoric inhabitants of the region. To the readers of 1909, this wasn't just a story. It was a challenge to the very foundation of what they believed about the American continent. It suggested that the history of the land was far older and far more complex than the textbooks dared to whisper. The Arizona Gazette article claimed that the Smithsonian Institution, under the direction of a Professor S.A. Jordan, was already involved in a massive excavation of the site. This detail added a layer of institutional authority to the mystery, painting a picture of a government-sanctioned effort to uncover a truth that would rewrite human history. And yet, as the years passed, the trail began to grow cold. The names of G.E. Kinkaid and Professor Jordan seemed to vanish from the official records, leaving behind only the yellowed pages of a newspaper and the enduring silence of the canyon itself. Was it a sophisticated hoax, a bit of yellow journalism designed to sell papers in a sleepy desert town? Or was it a glimpse into a reality that was simply too disruptive for the mainstream science of the day to acknowledge? We must consider the limits of what we know. Archaeology is often a science of the visible. We study what remains on the surface, what survives the ravages of wind and water. But the Grand Canyon is a place of infinite hiding spots. Its sheer walls are honeycombed with natural caves, many of which remain unexplored even today due to their extreme inaccessibility. The deep time of the canyon acts as a veil, covering the tracks of those who might have walked these paths thousands of years ago. When we speak of the Bronze Age, we are speaking of a time roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, an era when humanity began to master the Earth's ores. To imagine such a presence in the American Southwest requires us to rethink the possibilities of ancient maritime travel and the interconnectedness of the ancient world. As the desert twilight fades into a deep velvet blue, the canyon becomes a place of ghosts. The wind whistling through the limestone crevices can sound like distant voices, perhaps the hushed tones of Kinkaid's team as they move through the dark, or perhaps the echoes of a people who called these depths home long before the first Spanish explorers arrived on the rim. The mystery of the 1909 article remains a cornerstone of American folklore, a reminder that there are still places on this earth where the map is blank, where the great unknown still holds its breath, waiting for the light of a lantern to reveal what has been hidden in the dark for an eternity. The beauty of the Grand Canyon lies not just in its scale, but in its ability to keep a secret. Every layer of rock is a page in a book that we are still learning how to read. As we drift further into the history of this supposed underground city, we find ourselves wandering through a landscape where fact and myth are as intertwined as the roots of a desert juniper. There is no need for immediate answers tonight. The stone does not hurry, and neither should we. We are simply observers, drifting down the river of time, watching the canyon walls rise higher and higher around us until the stars above are the only guides we have left. Imagine the sound of a single drop of water falling from a limestone ceiling and echoing through a silence that has remained undisturbed for thousands of years. This is the stillness G.E. Kinkaid claimed to have broken in 1909 as he stood 2,000 feet above the churning Colorado River, staring into a shadow that refused to behave like a natural fissure in the rock. To reach this point, one must abandon the familiar trails of the Grand Canyon's rim and descend into a vertical wilderness of heat and ancient dust, where the geography itself seems designed to keep secrets. The location Kinkaid described was perched precariously on a sheer cliff face, a place where the wind whistles through the crags and the river below looks like nothing more than a silver thread winding through the belly of the earth. It was here, in a remote stretch of the canyon, roughly 42 miles upriver from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, that he allegedly discovered a portal into a world that should not exist. As we step into this imagined threshold, the transition from the rugged, chaotic beauty of the natural canyon to the intended precision of the cavern is immediate and jarring. Kinkaid spoke of a main entrance that was not a jagged hole, but a deliberate opening that led into a grand hall of staggering proportions. The walls here were not the crumbling shale or the layered sandstone one might expect, but were instead hewn with a mathematical exactness that defies the primitive tools of the Bronze Age. He described the stone as being cut with the smoothness of polished marble, every angle sharp and every surface level, suggesting a mastery of masonry that echoes the great works of the Old Kingdom in Egypt or the megalithic wonders of the Andes. The air inside is cool and heavy, carrying a scent of dry earth and something metallic, a lingering ghost of the industry that once thrived in these lightless depths. From this central artery, Kinkaid claimed that a series of tunnels radiated outward like the spokes of a giant wheel, or perhaps like the nervous system of a subterranean giant. These passages were not winding or organic. They were straight, purposeful, and uniform in their dimensions. To walk through them is to feel the weight of the entire Kaibab plateau pressing down from above, yet the architecture provides a strange sense of security, a feeling that whoever carved these halls understood the burdens of the earth and knew exactly how to hold them at bay. The geometry of the layout suggests a civilization that valued order and symmetry, a culture that sought to impose its will upon the very bones of the continent. As we wander deeper into this labyrinth, the silence becomes a physical presence, a thick velvet curtain that muffles our footsteps and makes our own breathing seem like a thunderous intrusion upon a long-forgotten sleep. The further one travels into these radiating tunnels, the more the aesthetic begins to shift from the purely functional to the deeply symbolic. Kinkaid's account noted the presence of carvings and hieroglyphics that felt distinctly Oriental or Egyptian in their execution. He spoke of strange, seated figures that resembled the Buddha, carved into niches with a serene and distant gaze, their hands folded in gestures of eternal peace. The walls were said to be adorned with symbols of birds and serpents, etched with a fine hand that captured the movement of life even in the stillness of the rock. This is where the mystery deepens, for these motifs are thousands of miles and an entire ocean away from their known origins. We are left to wonder if these were the works of travelers who crossed the Pacific in reed boats, or perhaps a remnant of a global culture that flourished before the Great Flood, a time when the world was more connected than our modern history books dare to suggest. The precision of the stone cutting is perhaps the most haunting detail of all. In the world of archaeology, we often look at stratigraphy, the layering of soil and rock over time, to understand the age of a site. But here, in the heart of the canyon, the standard rules of dating feel inadequate. If these chambers were carved during the Bronze Age, an era typically defined by the use of copper and tin between 3000 and 1200, before the Common Era, how did the inhabitants manage to slice through the dense rock of the canyon with such effortless grace? There are no soot marks on the ceilings from torches, no piles of discarded rubble at the entrance. It is as if the stone was simply willed away, or perhaps dissolved by a technology that has since been lost to the eroding winds of time, we are forced to consider the possibility that our understanding of human progress is not a straight line, but a series of peaks and valleys, where great heights of knowledge are reached only to be swallowed by the shadows of a dark age. As we move deeper into the subterranean chambers, the layout reveals rooms that Kinkaid believed were used for storage, for worship, and for the final rest of the dead. He described a great hall filled with mummies, each wrapped in a fabric that felt like linen, but possessed a strength that had endured for millennia. The bodies were laid out on stone tiers, their faces turned toward the heart of the mountain, waiting for a dawn that never comes. The presence of these silent sentinels adds a layer of reverence to the atmosphere. This was not merely a shelter or a mine, it was a sanctuary, a sacred space carved into the foundation of the world. The Egyptian influence mentioned in the original 1909 article suggests a connection to the Nile, but the Oriental touches point toward the East, creating a cultural tapestry that is as beautiful as it is confusing. It challenges our notions of isolation and suggests that the ancient world was a place of daring voyages and shared wisdom. In this quiet, lightless world, the concept of deep time becomes tangible. We often think of history in terms of centuries, but the Grand Canyon forces us to think in terms of eons. The rock that houses these tunnels is hundreds of millions of years old, a record of ancient seas and shifting continents. To carve a city into such a monument is an act of profound ambition. It is a statement of permanence in a world that is constantly changing. As the hours pass in our exploration, we might imagine the flicker of a lamp reflecting off the polished walls, casting long dancing shadows of the people who once called this place home. What language did they speak? What stars did they watch from the canyon's edge before retreating into the safety of the stone? The answers are buried beneath layers of dust, and the official silence of institutions that claim no such city was ever found. And so, we linger in the doorway of the main hall, looking back toward the small circle of light that marks the entrance. Outside, the sun is perhaps beginning to dip below the western rim, painting the canyon in shades of violet and gold. But in here, there is only the grey of the stone and the weight of the unknown. The eerie silence of the chambers is not a void, but a vessel, filled with the echoes of a story that is still waiting to be fully told. Whether Kinkaid's discovery was a grand hoax or a suppressed truth, the image of those radiating tunnels and the precision of their construction remains etched in the imagination. It reminds us that the earth is vast and our knowledge of it is small. There are still places where the map goes blank, where the shadows are deep, and where the past remains a kingdom that has yet to be conquered. We continue our descent, not with the frantic energy of a treasure hunter, but with the steady, patient heart of a dreamer, drifting further into the dark, where the stones themselves seem to breathe in the rhythm of the ages. Imagine for a moment the sensation of a cold, heavy silence pressing against your skin, the kind of silence that only exists deep within the roots of a mountain. As the lantern light flickers against the limestone walls, it reveals something that defies the logic of the desert above. There, sitting in the center of a vast, vaulted chamber, is a figure carved from the very heart of the solid stone. It is a large, cross-legged idol, its hands resting peacefully upon its knees, eyes closed in an eternal meditation. To the eyes of G.E. Kinkaid, the explorer whose accounts fueled this enduring mystery, the resemblance was unmistakable. He described it as a Buddha, a serene presence sitting in a posture of perfect stillness, thousands of miles from the temples of the East and thousands of years from the world he knew. The sight of such a figure in the depths of the Grand Canyon suggests a reality that is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. It hints at a time when the world was not a collection of isolated continents, but a vast, interconnected web of travelers and seekers. This idol, if it truly existed as described, represents a profound intersection of cultures. It speaks of a Bronze Age, that era of human history beginning roughly 5,000 years ago when we first learned to alloy copper and tin, where the boundaries of the map were far more fluid than we once believed. The stone itself seems to hold the weight of this forgotten connection, a silent witness to a voyage that history has failed to record. As the light moves beyond the central idol, it catches the glint of something metallic and strange. Scattered among the dust of the cavern floor are tools made of hardened copper, their edges still sharp enough to catch the eye. In the traditional understanding of North American history, the indigenous peoples of the Southwest were skilled in many arts, but the large-scale smelting and hardening of copper into complex tools was not a hallmark of their early development. These implements appeared out of place, as if they had been dropped by a craftsman from a distant land, one who understood the alchemy of the forge in a way that mirrored the great civilizations of the Mediterranean or the Indus Valley. Beside these tools, etched into the very skin of the canyon walls, are marks that challenge every convention of archaeology. Hieroglyphics, intricate and precise, wind their way across the rock faces. To the untrained eye, they appear as a chaotic dance of symbols, but to those who look closer, they carry the unmistakable rhythm of a written language. They bear a haunting resemblance to the scripts of ancient Egypt, a series of pictographs and phonetic signs that seem to tell a story of arrival, of survival, and perhaps of a long, slow decline into the shadows. In the world of mainstream science, which relies on stratigraphy, the study of rock layers to determine the age and sequence of events, and radiocarbon dating, the measurement of carbon isotopes to find the age of organic material, there is no room for Egyptian writing in the heart of Arizona. And yet, the description persists, a ghost in the machine of our historical narrative. The presence of these artifacts suggests a transoceanic voyage during an age when we assumed the oceans were impassable barriers. It forces us to reconsider the capabilities of Bronze Age mariners, those ancient sailors who navigated by the stars and the currents, perhaps following the trade winds across the Atlantic or the Pacific long before the Vikings or the Spanish ever dreamed of a new world. If a colony from a distant shore truly established an outpost within the Grand Canyon, it would mean that the history of indigenous North America is far more complex and layered than the textbooks suggest. It would mean that the Americas were never truly isolated, but were part of a global conversation that took place in the deep time of our collective past. This discovery, reported in the early 20th century, arrived at a time when the contemporary understanding of indigenous history was often rigid and limited. The idea that a sophisticated, seafaring civilization could have left its mark in the American West was seen by many as an impossibility, a fantasy born of overactive imaginations. However, for those who walk the quiet paths of the canyon today, the mystery remains a source of quiet contemplation. It challenges the limits of what we know, reminding us that the earth is a vast archive, and we have only begun to turn the first few pages. The hieroglyphics on the wall and the copper in the dust are like echoes from a distant room, muffled by the passage of centuries, yet still vibrating with the energy of those who once called this dark sanctuary home. As we linger in this chamber of stone and shadow, the implications begin to settle like the fine silt of a riverbed. We are looking at a potential rewrite of the human story, a narrative where the Bronze Age was a period of grand exploration and cultural exchange. The Golden Buddha and the Egyptian symbols are not just anomalies, they are invitations to look deeper into the cracks of our established timeline. They suggest that the desert is not a wasteland, but a repository of secrets, a place where the sun-bleached rocks hide a history that is as rich and varied as the colors of the canyon at twilight. The tools, the writing, and the idol all point toward a sophisticated understanding of the world, one that utilized the resources of the earth to create something lasting. The hardening of copper requires a specific knowledge of temperature and composition, a technical skill that speaks of a settled, organized society. Meanwhile, the act of carving a massive idol from a single block of stone requires a dedication of time and labor that suggests a deeply rooted spiritual life. These were not the works of a passing band of nomads, but the deliberate creations of a people who intended to stay, who saw in the depths of the Grand Canyon a sacred space worthy of their most precious symbols. As the years passed, the story of Kinkaid's cave became a legend, a tale whispered by those who feel the pull of the unknown. But even if the physical evidence remains elusive, tucked away in a restricted corner of the national park or lost to a collapse of the fragile shale, the idea itself remains potent. It asks us to imagine a world where the map was still being drawn, where every horizon held the promise of a new beginning, and where the ancient Egyptians or the followers of Eastern philosophies might have looked upon the red walls of the Colorado River and seen a reflection of the divine. In the stillness of this subterranean world, the air feels thick with the presence of the past. We move through these halls not as conquerors of information, but as humble observers of the mystery, the younger Dryas, that sudden return to glacial conditions that occurred nearly 13,000 years ago, reminds us that the climate and the landscape are ever-changing, capable of swallowing entire civilizations and leaving only a few scattered stones behind. Perhaps the inhabitants of this cave were refugees from such a change, seeking shelter in the belly of the earth, bringing their gods and their tools with them as they fled a world in flux. The weight of these ages is felt in every breath. We are drifting now through the corridors of time, where the distinction between fact and folklore begins to blur like the edges of a dream. The hieroglyphics remain silent, their meanings locked away in a language we have forgotten how to hear, while the copper tools rest in the darkness, waiting for a hand that will never return. And so we continue to descend, leaving the light of the surface far behind, guided only by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the earth itself as we move toward the next chamber in this labyrinth of history. As we move deeper into this cavernous narrative, our path is lit by the flickering torchlight of a single name, a name that carries the weight of authority and the mystery of a ghost. According to the original account published in the Phoenix Gazette on the 5th of April, 1909, the excavation of this subterranean citadel was not a mere amateur endeavor, but a sophisticated operation led by a man named Professor S.A. Jordan. He is described as a figure of immense academic stature, a seasoned explorer sent from the hallowed halls of the Smithsonian institution to oversee what was whispered to be the most significant discovery in the history of the American continent. In the quiet, cool air of the canyon, it is easy to imagine him, a man of the early 20th century, perhaps wearing a wide-brimmed felt hat and a coat stained by the red dust of the Arizona desert, standing at the mouth of the cave with a lantern in hand, peering into a darkness that had not been disturbed for thousands of years. The Gazette claimed that Professor Jordan did not work alone. He was reportedly supported by a team of 30 to 40 people, a small army of laborers and specialists working under the direct supervision of the United States government. In the context of 1909, the logistical scale of such an undertaking is staggering to contemplate. To sustain 40 people in the remote, jagged heart of the Grand Canyon would have required a constant stream of supplies, water, food, tools, and kerosene, hauled by mule trains over treacherous, narrow trails where a single misstep meant a plunge into the abyss. It would have meant a sprawling camp of tents perched on the edge of the Colorado River, the sound of hammers and voices echoing off the limestone walls, and the smoke of cook fires drifting up toward the narrow strip of blue sky far above. And yet, as we sift through the archives of the Smithsonian, searching for the footprints of Professor Jordan, the trail goes cold. There is a peculiar silence in the official record, a void where a man of his supposed prominence should be. The Smithsonian Institution has stated repeatedly that they have no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan ever being in their employ, nor any documentation of an expedition to the Grand Canyon during that era that yielded Egyptian or Tibetan artifacts. In the world of archaeology, where every shard of pottery and every day's labor is typically recorded in meticulous field notes and ledger books, this absence is profound. It leads us to wonder if Professor Jordan was a real man whose identity was later scrubbed from the annals of history, or if he was a character in a grand, elaborate fiction, a phantom created to give the story the veneer of scientific legitimacy. The mystery deepens when we consider the nature of institutional memory. Some suggest that the lack of records is evidence of a deliberate cover-up, a systematic erasing of a discovery that threatened to overturn the established timeline of human migration. They point to the vast, labyrinthine basements of museums where thousands of crates remain unopened, their contents destined to be forgotten by time. Perhaps, they argue, the artifacts are there, tucked away in a corner of a warehouse, gathering dust while the world moves on. Others see the absence of Jordan as the simplest proof that the story was a tall tale, a piece of yellow journalism designed to sell newspapers in a frontier town hungry for wonder. But even if we set aside the man, we cannot so easily set aside the logistics. If 30 to 40 people were indeed working in those caves, they would have left behind more than just the treasures they were seeking. Archaeology is as much about the debris of the living as it is about the monuments of the dead. There would be tin cans, broken glass, the remains of fire pits, and the inevitable wear and tear on the stone surfaces caused by dozens of boots. The Grand Canyon is a place that preserves history with a jealous intensity. The dry, thin air and the sheltered alcoves can keep a piece of wood or a fragment of leather intact for centuries. If such a large-scale government operation took place, the canyon walls themselves should still bear the scars of their presence. As we linger on the image of this lost expedition, we are forced to confront the limits of what we can truly know about the past. We live in an age of satellites and digital maps, where every square inch of the Earth's surface has been photographed and categorized, yet the Grand Canyon remains a wilderness of secrets. It is a place of stratigraphy, the layering of rock over millions of years, where the bottom-most layers represent the very dawn of time. To suggest that a Bronze Age civilization found a home here is to add another layer to that history, one that sits uncomfortably between the geological reality of the stone and the mythological aspirations of the human spirit. Professor Jordan remains a shadow, a symbol of the tension between the official narrative of our history and the fringe theories that haunt its edges. Did he walk through these tunnels, tracing the outlines of hieroglyphics with a trembling finger, or is he merely a ghost of the imagination, a guide for a journey that never happened? The silence of the Smithsonian is either a shield or a void, and in the quiet of the canyon, both possibilities seem equally heavy. We are left to navigate the darkness without a map, relying on the fragments of a century-old newspaper article to light our way. The deeper we go, the more the air seems to thicken with the weight of forgotten ages. We find ourselves asking if the truth of the Grand Canyon is something that can be found in a museum ledger, or if it is something felt in the marrow of the bone when the wind whistles through a high, inaccessible cave. The story of Professor Jordan is a reminder that history is often a collection of stories we choose to believe, a fragile bridge built over the vast, churning river of time. And so, we continue our descent, moving past the phantom of the professor and toward the artifacts themselves, seeking the tangible remains of a dream that refuses to die. The silence of a grand institution is a heavy thing, a weight that settles over the archives like the fine grey dust of centuries. When the morning sun filters through the high windows of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, it illuminates millions of catalogued items, each with its own paper trail, its own verified origin, its own place in the grand narrative of human progress. Yet for over 100 years, a specific void has existed in these records, a space where the names of Professor S.A. Jordan and G.E. Kinkaid should, by all rights, be etched in ink. Instead, one finds a persistent, measured denial that has become as much a part of the mystery as the cave itself. As we turn our attention from the legends of the canyon floor to the sterile hallways of academia, we encounter a strange friction. The Smithsonian has, for decades, maintained a consistent and unwavering stance. They have no record of a Professor Jordan, no record of a Kinkaid, and certainly no record of an Egyptian-themed treasure room hidden within the red wall limestone. To the institution, the story is a colourful piece of folklore, a remnant of the yellow journalism era, when newspapers were more concerned with selling copies than with the rigours of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and their chronological sequence. And yet, the contrast between the Gazette's exhaustive 3,000-word report and the institutional silence is jarring. The article did not merely hint at a discovery. It provided names, dates, and specific descriptions of artifacts that would have rewritten the history of the Americas. If we look closely at the year 1909, we find a world on the brink of modern archaeology, a time when the Smithsonian was indeed sending expeditions into the far reaches of the American West. Researchers have spent countless hours combing through the annual reports and personnel logs from that era, looking for a ghost. They search for Jordan, a man described as a leading light of the institution, yet his name does not appear on any official payroll or list of contributors. This absence is the primary anchor for the mainstream dismissal of the story. If the man did not exist, the logic goes, then the cave he supposedly explored must be a phantom as well. But for those who find themselves drawn to the hidden corners of history, this lack of evidence is not a dead end, but a starting point for a deeper, more unsettling theory. Meanwhile, the suppression theory began to take root in the fertile soil of public doubt. Alternative historians suggest that the absence of these names is not a sign of a hoax, but evidence of a systematic erasure. They point to the sensitivity of such a find, a cross-cultural exchange between the old world and the new, occurring thousands of years before Christopher Columbus or even the Vikings reached these shores. Such a discovery would not just be a curiosity, it would be a foundational earthquake, shattering the established timeline of human migration and the isolation of the Western Hemisphere. In the quiet logic of the suppression theory, it is far easier to lose a few pages of a ledger than it is to rewrite every textbook in the world. As the years passed, the Smithsonian's denials took on a repetitive, almost ritualistic quality. In the 1960s and 70s, as interest in the mystery surged again, curious citizens wrote letters to the institution asking for clarity. The replies were always the same, a polite but firm statement that no such expedition ever took place. The institution points to the fact that the Grand Canyon is one of the most heavily surveyed places on Earth, and that no modern hiker, geologist, or park ranger has ever stumbled upon the entrance Kinkaid described. They argue that a cavern capable of housing 50,000 people, as the article claimed, could not simply vanish into the desert air. And yet, we must consider the nature of the canyon itself. It is a labyrinth of nearly 2 million acres, a vertical wilderness where entire side canyons remain unexplored by human feet for decades at a time. The heat shimmers off the stone, creating mirages that dance between the shadows, and the scale of the cliffs is so vast that a man-made entrance, even a large one, could be easily obscured by a simple rockfall or the shifting angles of the sun. The official stance relies on the idea that our modern maps are complete, that every shadow has been measured and every grotto catalogued. But anyone who has stood on the rim and felt the cold wind rising from the depths knows that the canyon keeps its secrets with a jealous intensity. When we examine the paper trail, or the lack thereof, we are forced to weigh the credibility of a single newspaper report against the institutional memory of a nation. The Arizona Gazette was a reputable publication in 1909, not a tabloid. Why would they invent such a detailed, technical story, complete with the involvement of a major scientific body, only to never mention it again? Some suggest it was a space filler, a common practice in early journalism, where writers would craft tall tales to occupy empty columns. But the sheer volume of detail in the Kinkaid report, the descriptions of the granaries, the layout of the halls, the specific types of copper tools, suggests a level of effort that far exceeds a simple prank. In the archives of the mind, we begin to wonder if the truth lies in the grey space between these two extremes. Could there have been an expedition that was not official, perhaps funded by private interests, but utilizing Smithsonian personnel in an off-the-record capacity? History is full of such shadows, of men who worked in the margins of great institutions, their names never making it into the formal annual reports. As the dust motes dance in the light of the Smithsonian's reading rooms, one cannot help but feel the weight of the unrecorded past. We speak often of the historical record as if it were a complete and perfect thing, but it is more like a tattered tapestry, full of holes and frayed edges, where the truth has simply drifted away. The emergence of the suppression theory reflects a growing tension in our understanding of the past. It is a conflict between the diffusionists, who believe that ancient civilizations were far more mobile and interconnected than we give them credit for, and the isolationists, who maintain that the Americas developed in total solitude until the late Middle Ages. To the diffusionist, the Grand Canyon cave is the smoking gun, the ultimate proof that the Bronze Age was a global phenomenon, reaching even the red rock heart of the American Southwest. To the isolationist, the story is a dangerous distraction, a myth that undermines the genuine and unique achievements of the indigenous peoples of the region. As we linger in this institutional silence, we are reminded of the limits of our knowledge. We rely on the experts to act as the gatekeepers of our history, to tell us what is real and what is fantasy. But the experts are human, and institutions are built to preserve their own stability. The idea of an Egyptian colony in the Grand Canyon is not just a geological anomaly. It is a threat to the order of things. And so, the papers remain missing, the names remain unlisted, and the cave remains a ghost in the machine. But the human spirit is not easily satisfied by a denial. As long as the article exists in the archives of the Arizona Gazette, as long as the descriptions of the golden Buddha-like statues and the strange hieroglyphs remain in the public consciousness, the mystery will endure. We are drawn to the possibility that there is more to our story than what is written in the textbooks. We are drawn to the idea that beneath the surface of the earth, hidden in a place where the light of the sun never reaches, there is a vault containing the lost memories of a forgotten age. And so, we leave the quiet halls of the Smithsonian behind, the echoes of their denials fading as we return to the canyon itself. We move away from the paper trail and back toward the stone, toward the tangible remains that Kinkaid claimed to have touched with his own hands. If the institution will not provide the answers, we must look to the artifacts themselves, to the strange, out-of-place objects that have surfaced over the years, whispered about in the back rooms of trading posts and in the campfire stories of the desert. We are seeking the physical evidence of a dream, a bridge made of copper and gold that spans the vast, dark river of time. The stone itself tells a story much older than any human myth, a silent chronicle written in the language of pressure and time. When we look at the walls of the Grand Canyon, we are looking at the exposed pages of the Earth's own diary, where the red wall limestone stands as a particularly thick and stubborn chapter. This layer, formed over 300 million years ago from the compressed remains of ancient sea creatures, glows with a deceptive warmth in the midday sun, but its true nature is found in the dark. It is a porous, soluble rock, a landscape that breathes through its pores. Over millions of years, rainwater, slightly acidic from its journey through the atmosphere, has seeped into the microscopic fractures of this limestone, slowly dissolving the calcium carbonate and hollowing out vast, cathedral-like spaces within the cliffside. These are the natural caverns of the canyon, subterranean worlds where water drips in a rhythmic, eternal heartbeat, carving stalactites that hang like frozen needles from the ceiling. To the untrained eye, or to a man fueled by the fever of discovery, these natural formations can easily take on the appearance of something intentional. A rectangular opening in the rock, carved by the precise shearing of a fault line, might look like a doorway. A flat shelf of stone, levelled by the steady erosion of a prehistoric stream, might be mistaken for a sacrificial altar or a sleeping bench. In the deep silence of the canyon, where the wind whistles through these apertures, it is easy to imagine that the sound is the echo of a flute or the hushed conversation of a people who vanished before the first histories were ever written. As we consider the claims of G.E. Kinkaid and his sprawling underground citadel, we must weigh the architectural precision he described against the chaotic, organic beauty of the red wall's natural plumbing. He spoke of a main chamber from which radiating tunnels branched out like the spokes of a wheel, an arrangement that suggests a highly organized central authority. In the world of geology, such patterns are rare but not impossible. Water follows the path of least resistance, and where the rock is fractured in a radial pattern, the caves will follow. Yet the question remains whether a natural cavern system could truly house the hundreds of rooms Kinkaid reported, or if the sheer scale of the canyon simply distorts our sense of what is possible. The difficulty of reaching such a place cannot be overstated. The location Kinkaid described sits high above the churning waters of the Colorado River, nestled in a vertical world where the concept of a path is a mere abstraction. In 1909, without the benefit of modern nylon ropes, mechanical cams, or lightweight climbing harnesses, the feat of accessing a cave entrance hundreds of feet up a sheer cliff face borders on the miraculous. Even for a seasoned explorer, the physical toll of navigating the canyon's inner gorge is immense. The heat radiates off the dark basalt at the river's edge, rising like a shimmering curtain, while the limestone above remains cold and indifferent. To transport tools, food, and the heavy artifacts Kinkaid claimed to have found, granite statues and copper instruments, would have required a logistical effort of staggering proportions. One must wonder how a lone adventurer, or even a small team from the Smithsonian, could have moved such weight across a landscape that resists every human footstep. And yet, the canyon is a master of illusion, a place where the scale of the surroundings humbles the human perspective until the mind begins to seek patterns in the chaos. As the sun moves across the sky, the shifting shadows perform a slow, silent dance across the rock faces. A jagged promontory that looks like a crumbling tower at 10 in the morning may dissolve into a featureless slope by noon, only to reappear as the profile of a giant's face in the golden hour of evening. This phenomenon, known as pareidolia, is the tendency of the human brain to find familiar shapes in random data, to see faces in clouds or cities in the stars. In the vastness of the Grand Canyon, where a single side canyon can be miles long, the eye can easily assemble the scattered debris of a rockfall into the ruins of a fortress, or mistake the dark maw of a natural sinkhole for the entrance to a king's tomb. The basalt layers deeper down, born of fire and volcanic upheaval, provide a stark contrast to the soft, eroding limestone above. These dark, dense rocks do not give way to water so easily. They stand as the foundation of the canyon, ancient and unyielding. If a civilization were to carve a permanent home here, they would have had to contend with these two very different masters, the limestone that crumbles and the basalt that breaks the strongest chisel. We must ask ourselves if a Bronze Age culture, possessing tools of copper and stone, could truly have made a dent in such a formidable terrain. Copper is a soft metal, and while the addition of tin or arsenic creates a harder bronze, it still pales in comparison to the igneous rock of the canyon's basement. Perhaps they didn't carve at all, but rather found what nature had already provided, moving into the ready-made cathedrals of the Red Wall, and adding only the finishing touches: a smoothed floor, a widened doorway, a coat of pigment. This brings us to the concept of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers that tells us the relative age of everything within them. In a traditional archaeological site, the deeper you dig, the further back in time you travel. But in the Grand Canyon, the digging has already been done by the river, exposing billions of years of history in a single vertical sweep. If a citadel were built into the Red Wall limestone, it would be perched atop layers that are 500 million years old, yet the inhabitants themselves would be a mere blink in the eye of deep time. The sheer verticality of the canyon means that an outpost could remain hidden not by miles of distance, but by a few hundred feet of impossible height. A cave entrance could be perfectly visible from the river below, yet remain as unreachable as the moon to anyone without the wings of a hawk. As we drift deeper into the mystery, we must consider the atmosphere of the canyon itself, the way the air grows heavy and still in the depths of the gorge, and how the silence is so profound it seems to have a weight of its own. In such a place, the line between the physical world and the world of the imagination begins to blur. The shadows cast by the towering buttes are not just absences of light. They are deep blue-black shapes that seem to have substance. They pool in the hollows of the cliffs like dark water, hiding the entrances to 1,000 secrets. It is in these shadows that the Kinkaid story lives on, protected by the very scale of the landscape that makes its existence so improbable. If we are to find the truth, we must look past the tricks of the light and the romanticism of the lost explorer. We must look at the way the water flows, the way the stone breaks, and the way the human spirit recoils from the idea of being truly alone in such a vast, empty space. We populate the wilderness with ghosts and cities because the alternative, that we are the first and only ones to ever stand in this silence, is a loneliness too great to bear. And so, we continue to scan the Red Wall limestone, looking for that one shadow that doesn't move with the sun, that one line that is too straight to be natural, waiting for the canyon to finally give up its dead and speak the names of those who once called these shadows home. To understand the mysterious report of the Arizona Gazette, we must first understand the ink and paper that gave it life. The year 1909 was not merely a time of exploration, but a time of storytelling, a period where the boundary between a reporter and a weaver of legends was often blurred by the desperate need to sell a morning edition. In the early 20th century, the newspaper was the only window into the wider world, and in the bustling editorial rooms of the American West, the truth was often seen as a secondary concern to the spectacle. This was the era of yellow journalism, a term used to describe the sensationalist, lurid, and often fabricated stories that fueled the circulation wars between media giants. In the dusty offices of Phoenix, editors knew that a story about a missing mule or a slight change in the price of copper would not capture the public's imagination, but a story about a hidden Egyptian tomb buried beneath the layers of the Grand Canyon, that was a story that could travel across the continent on the wings of the telegraph. As we look back through the yellowed archives, we see a landscape populated by tall tales, a uniquely American tradition of exaggerating the natural world until it touched the divine or the impossible. The pioneers and prospectors who sat around campfires in the desert night were masters of this craft, and the journalists of the time were their eager pupils. They understood that the public possessed a bottomless appetite for the extraordinary. Only a few decades earlier, the nation had been captivated by the Cardiff giant, a 10-foot-tall, petrified man unearthed in New York that turned out to be nothing more than carved gypsum and a clever marketing scheme. Even when the hoax was revealed, the crowds continued to pay their nickels to see it, drawn more by the feeling of wonder than the reality of the stone. There was something in the air during those years, a collective yearning to find deep roots in a land that felt new and untamed. Across the Atlantic, the world of archaeology was being shaken by discoveries that seemed to step straight out of myth. When Heinrich Schliemann announced he had found the ruins of Troy, the legendary city of Homer's Iliad, he proved that the stories we once dismissed as fables might actually be grounded in the soil. If Troy was real, then what else might be hiding in the unexplored corners of the globe? The public watched as the sands of Egypt gave up the secrets of the Valley of the Kings, and they began to wonder if their own canyons held similar treasures. This was the cultural soil in which the story of G.E. Kinkaid and his subterranean city was planted. It was a time when the Kensington runestone was being debated in Minnesota, a slab of rock covered in Norse runes that suggested Vikings had reached the heart of the continent centuries before Columbus. Whether these finds were genuine or the work of clever forgers, they spoke to a desire to populate the American wilderness with an ancient, sophisticated past. We wanted to believe that we were not the first to gaze upon the majestic vistas of the West, that a grand, lost civilization had once walked the same paths we were now treading. The Arizona Gazette, like many small-town papers of the era, operated on a thin margin. In the fierce competition for readers, a sensational headline was a survival tactic. The story of the Grand Canyon Cave was published on the 5th of April, 1909, and it bore all the hallmarks of a classic newspaper yarn. It was detailed enough to be immersive, yet vague enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. It utilized the authority of the Smithsonian institution to lend it weight, a common tactic in yellow journalism, where the names of prestigious organizations were invoked to silence the skeptics. As the years passed, the story of the Egyptian outpost became a part of the canyon's own folklore, drifting through the decades like a ghost ship in the fog. We must ask ourselves if the editors of the Gazette truly believed in Kinkaid's discovery, or if they were simply giving the people what they craved, a moment of magic in a world that was rapidly becoming mapped and understood. There is a certain comfort in the idea of a hoax. It suggests that even if the city isn't there, our imagination is vast enough to build one out of nothing but words and wonder. In the quiet of the present day, we look at the stratigraphy, the study of rock layers that tells the story of the Earth's deep time, and we see no evidence of Bronze Age tools or Egyptian pottery. The science of archaeology relies on this physical record, the hard evidence left behind in the silt and stone. But the history of the human mind is different. It is built on the stories we tell ourselves in the dark. The 1909 report may have been a product of its time, a flickering lamp held up against the overwhelming darkness of the canyon's depths. But it reveals a truth about our nature. We are a species that abhors a vacuum. Where there is a void in our history, we fill it with dreams of gold and kings. As the river continues its slow, rhythmic carving of the stone, we are reminded that the canyon itself is a master of deception. Shadows stretch into shapes that look like doorways. Pillars of rock resemble the crumbling ruins of temples. In the hazy heat of a summer afternoon, it is easy to see how a lonely traveler might see a city where there is only silence. The era of yellow journalism may have passed, replaced by the clinical precision of modern research, but the impulse remains. We still scan the horizon for the things we have lost, waiting for a sign that the world is much older and much more mysterious than we have been led to believe. And so, we find ourselves caught between two worlds, the world of the verifiable, where every shard of flint is measured and mapped, and the world of the legend, where the Grand Canyon remains a place of infinite secrets. The story of the Gazette is a reminder that history is not just what happened, but what we wished had happened. It is the sound of a printing press humming in the night, turning out pages of beautiful, impossible dreams that served as a lullaby for a young nation. As the light fades from the canyon walls, turning the red stone to a deep, bruised purple, the line between fact and fiction begins to dissolve, leaving us alone with the wind and the weight of the ages. The scent of damp sagebrush and iron-rich dust rises from the canyon floor, a perfume that has lingered in these shadows for thousands of years. While the headlines of 1909 spoke of gold and mummies, the actual stones of the Grand Canyon tell a story that is perhaps less sensational, yet infinitely more profound. To understand the myth of the Egyptian cave, we must first listen to the voices that have never left these cliffs, the voices of the ancestral Puebloans, the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Havasupai. Their history is not written on papyrus, but etched into the very skin of the earth, a record of survival and spiritual connection that predates the arrival of any explorer. Long before the printing presses of the Arizona Gazette began to churn, the ancestors of the modern Hopi people were carving a life out of the vertical world. These were the ancestral Puebloans, whom the Navajo call the Anasazi, a word meaning the ancient ones. They did not need to build hidden cities of gold, for they had mastered the art of living within the breath of the canyon itself. Throughout the gorge, tucked into high, inaccessible alcoves, one can still find the remains of their granaries, small, perfectly circular structures made of stacked stone and mud mortar. These were the storehouses of a civilization designed to keep corn, beans, and squash safe from the elements and the reach of rodents. To a casual observer or a desperate treasure hunter peering through the haze of a summer afternoon, these stone silos might easily be mistaken for the entrances to something more mysterious, something more monumental. As the river winds its way through the metamorphic basement rock, it passes sites that the Hopi hold as the most sacred in their entire cosmology. Deep within the canyon, near the confluence of the Colorado and the Little Colorado rivers, lies the Sipapu. In the Hopi tradition, this is the place of emergence, the physical portal through which the first humans climbed out of a previous world and into this one. It is a natural salt dome, a hummock of mineral deposits formed by the slow, rhythmic bubbling of a spring. To the uninitiated, it is a geological curiosity. To the Hopi, it is the umbilical cord of the world. One cannot help but wonder if the stories of a vast underground city with thousands of rooms were merely a distorted colonial echo of this profound belief in a subterranean origin. The myth-makers of the early 20th century took a spiritual truth and attempted to turn it into a physical tomb, replacing the sacred emergence with the cold finality of an Egyptian burial. If we look closely at the walls of the canyon, we find a library of symbols that predates the Rosetta Stone. The petroglyphs and pictographs left by the ancient dwellers are masterpieces of minimalism, depicting bighorn sheep, flute players, and geometric spirals that track the movement of the sun. The 1909 article claimed that hieroglyphics were found inside the cave, yet every archaeological survey of the region has found only the distinct, beautiful iconography of the indigenous Southwest. There is a certain tragedy in the way the Gazette story looked at these native artworks and could only see them as Egyptian or Oriental. It reveals a refusal to believe that the people already living on this land were capable of their own architectural and artistic wonders. The hieroglyphs were likely the graceful, stylized figures of the basket-maker culture, symbols that spoke of rain, migration, and the movements of the stars, rather than the lineages of pharaohs. The Havasupai, the people of the blue-green water, have lived within the canyon's embrace for over 800 years. Their presence is a testament to the canyon's hospitality for those who know its secrets. Their traditional homes and agricultural terraces prove that the canyon was never a wasteland waiting to be discovered, but a vibrant, inhabited landscape. When we speak of lost civilizations, we often ignore the ones that never left. The Havasupai and their neighbors possess a deep ancestral knowledge of the canyon's hidden passages and water sources. To them, the idea of a secret Egyptian outpost is a strange fantasy, for they know every fold in the rock, every seep in the limestone, and every path that leads from the rim to the river. Their history is measured in the growth of cottonwood trees and the seasonal flow of the waterfalls, a timeline that stretches back far beyond the reach of modern memory. Archaeology, in its most patient form, uses tools like radiocarbon dating to peer through the veil of time. By measuring the decay of carbon atoms in organic remains, bits of yucca fiber sandals, corn cobs, or charcoal from ancient hearths, scientists have mapped a continuous human presence in the Grand Canyon for at least 12,000 years. This timeline places the first inhabitants here during the end of the last ice age, a period known as the Younger Dryas, when the climate was shifting violently and the megafauna were beginning to vanish. These people were not visitors from across the sea. They were the first Americans adapting to a changing world with incredible ingenuity. They lived in the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and rock, long before the first stone was laid for the pyramids at Giza. The truth of the canyon is not found in a single sudden arrival of a foreign fleet, but in the slow, agonizingly beautiful process of humans becoming part of the landscape. As we consider the vastness of this history, the 1909 mystery begins to feel like a small, flickering candle in a very large room. The genuine cliff dwellings at sites like Nankoweap or Bright Angel Creek are far more impressive than any fictional tomb. These structures were built with an intimate understanding of thermal mass, positioned to catch the warmth of the winter sun while remaining shaded during the brutal heat of July. The masonry is precise, the placement strategic, and the silence that inhabits them now is heavy with the weight of centuries. When the wind whistles through the empty doorways of these stone houses, it sounds like a long, slow breath, a reminder that the canyon remembers everyone who has ever walked its narrow trails, whether their stories were printed in the newspaper or whispered into the red dust. There is a profound difference between a mystery that is solved and a mystery that is respected. The search for G.E. Kinkaid's cave may be a pursuit of shadows, but the search for the real history of the canyon dwellers leads us to a deeper understanding of human resilience. We find ourselves looking at the same horizon that the ancestral Puebloans watched 1,000 years ago, seeing the same purple shadows stretch across the Kaibab limestone. The Egyptian myth was a product of its time, a reflection of a young nation's desire to find its own ancient roots, even if it had to invent them. But the real history, the one written in the granaries and the sipapu, requires no invention. It only requires us to be quiet enough to hear what the canyon has been trying to tell us all along. Meanwhile, the river continues its work, cutting deeper into the heart of the continent, exposing rock that is nearly 2 billion years old. In the face of such deep time, the distinction between 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago starts to blur. We are all merely temporary residents in this cathedral of stone. Whether we are searching for Egyptian gold or simply trying to understand the people who came before us, we are all drawn to the Grand Canyon for the same reason. It is one of the few places left on Earth where the veil between the past and the present feels thin enough to touch. And as the night air cools and the stars begin to emerge, we are reminded that the greatest mysteries are not the ones we solve, but the ones we choose to live within. The scent of cedar smoke and damp earth often lingers in the high desert air, a fragrance that has likely remained unchanged for thousands of years, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 forgotten winters. To consider the possibility of ancient mariners reaching these canyon walls, we must first look toward the vast, restless expanse of the Pacific and the silhouettes of ships that history tells us should not have been there. There is a persistent whisper in the margins of archaeology, a suggestion that the great oceans were not barriers, but highways, travelled by civilizations long before the rise of the Roman Empire or the voyages of the Vikings. We imagine the Phoenicians, those master navigators of the Mediterranean, or perhaps the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, peering out from the Pillars of Hercules or the Red Sea, possessed by a curiosity that outweighed their fear of the unknown. These were peoples who understood the language of the stars and the rhythmic pulse of the currents, building vessels of cedar and papyrus that were far more resilient than we often give them credit for. The technical capabilities of Bronze Age shipwrights are frequently underestimated in our modern era, yet when we examine the remains of the Khufu ship or the seafaring galleys depicted in the Temple of Hatshepsut, we see a sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics and structural integrity. They utilized mortise and tenon joints, a method of fastening timber without nails, allowing the hull to flex with the pressure of the deep sea rather than snapping against it. With such craft, the journey across the Atlantic or the Pacific becomes less a matter of impossibility and more a question of endurance and the whims of the wind. As the centuries drift by like silt in a slow-moving river, we find ourselves searching for the physical echoes of these hypothetical visitors. The primary motivation for such a perilous journey would likely not have been mere exploration, but the pursuit of the most precious commodities of the ancient world, metals. In the Bronze Age, the alloy of copper and tin was the very foundation of power, the material of both the plough and the sword. While copper was relatively abundant in the Mediterranean, tin was a rarity, a ghost of a mineral that drove trade routes into the furthest reaches of Britain and beyond. Some theorists suggest that the hunger for these ores may have driven the boldest of sailors across the great waters to the American West, a land rich in mineral wealth that remained largely untapped by the standards of the Old World. They looked to the copper mines of the Great Lakes or the silver veins of the desert mountains, wondering if the tools that shaped the grandeur of the pharaohs were forged from the bones of a distant continent. Yet as we trace this thread of thought through the labyrinthine corridors of the Grand Canyon, we encounter a profound geographical puzzle. Even if we accept the premise of transoceanic contact, the Grand Canyon presents itself as an incredibly unlikely destination for a maritime expedition. To reach these depths from the Pacific, a fleet would have to navigate the treacherous mouth of the Colorado River, battling upstream against a fierce and unpredictable current for hundreds of miles through some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. The river, before it was tamed by modern dams, was a wild and silt-heavy beast, prone to violent flooding and choked with rapids that would shatter a wooden hull in a matter of seconds. For a Bronze Age mariner, the canyon would not have looked like a sanctuary or a site for a colony. It would have looked like a magnificent, terrifying dead end. The sheer verticality of the landscape, while beautiful to the modern eye, offers little in the way of arable land or easy access to the resources a distant outpost would require to survive. We must also consider the silence of the soil. In archaeology, we look for stratigraphy, which is simply the layering of earth over time, like the pages of a book. If a foreign civilization had occupied these caves for any significant duration, we would expect to find a distinct layer of their presence, discarded pottery of a Mediterranean style, tools of cast bronze rather than knapped stone, or the biological signatures of plants and animals brought from across the sea. Instead, the deeper we dig into the dust of the canyon floor, the more we find a consistent record of the indigenous peoples who have called this place home for millennia. The mystery remains, however, because history is rarely a closed book. We are constantly refining our understanding of deep time, that vast expanse of history that predates our written records. We use tools like radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes in organic matter, to tell us how long ago a fire was lit or a sandal was woven. Sometimes these dates surprise us, pushing the timeline of human arrival in the Americas further back into the shadows of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climatic cooling that occurred roughly 12,900 years ago. It was a time of great upheaval, when the glaciers were retreating and the world was being reshaped by wind and water. In such a fluid landscape, it is easy to imagine that much has been lost to the erasures of time. The desert is a master of preservation, but it is also a master of disguise. Perhaps the evidence we seek is not buried in the earth, but etched into the cultural memories of the people who remained. As we sit in the stillness of the canyon, watching the shadows of the ravens dance across the red rock, we are forced to grapple with the limits of our own knowledge. We want to believe in the Bronze Age mariners because their story represents a triumph of the human spirit over the vastness of the world. We want to believe that the ancient Egyptians looked upon these same stars and felt the same sense of insignificance that we feel today. But the canyon does not give up its secrets easily. It demands a certain humility from those who walk its paths. The idea of a hidden Egyptian vault filled with gold and mummies may be a fantasy born of the early 20th century's obsession with the exotic, but it speaks to a deeper truth, our innate desire to find connections where none seem to exist. We look at the pyramidal shapes of the canyon buttes, the Cheops Pyramid, the Tower of Ra, the Temple of Isis, and we see the architecture of the Nile reflected in the geology of the West. It is a trick of the light, a coincidence of erosion, yet it reinforces the feeling that we are wandering through a landscape that is both alien and strangely familiar. The search for Old World metals in the American West continues to haunt the edges of mainstream science, fueled by occasional finds of out-of-place artifacts or controversial inscriptions. Yet for every anomalous coin or stone tablet, there are 1,000 questions that remain unanswered. If they were here, why did they leave no lasting mark on the genetics of the local populations? Why did their technology not transform the societies they encountered? It is possible that these visitors were not conquerors or colonists, but ghosts, small groups of storm-tossed sailors who arrived with nothing and left with even less, their stories dissolving into the oral traditions of the desert. In the grand tapestry of time, a human life is but a single thread, and a civilization is but a brief pattern that eventually unravels. The Grand Canyon has watched civilizations rise and fall with the indifference of a god. It has seen the coming and going of the Ancestral Puebloans, the migrations of the southern Paiute, and the arrival of the Spanish explorers, all of whom were merely temporary residents in this cathedral of stone. As the night deepens and the temperature drops, the silence of the canyon becomes almost tactile, a heavy blanket that muffles the worries of the modern world. We are left to wonder if the truth of the 1909 discovery lies somewhere between fact and folklore, a mythic reflection of our own longing for a past that is more complex and interconnected than we can prove. The Bronze Age mariners may never have steered their ships into the heart of the Arizona desert, but the idea of them remains a powerful testament to the enduring mystery of the sea and the land. We are all, in a sense, navigators of a vast and uncertain history, trying to find our way through a landscape
where the landmarks are constantly shifting.
And so we continue to look into the shadows of the caves and the depths of the river, waiting for the earth to speak, while the stars continue their slow, silent march across the velvet sky. The steady, rhythmic hum of a modern drone motor is a sound that G.E. Kinkaid could never have imagined as he paddled his lone wooden skiff through the churning rapids of the Colorado River. It is a sterile, mechanical buzz that slices through the ancient silence of the gorge, carrying with it the eyes of a new generation of explorers. These are the digital age voyagers, equipped not with pickaxes and rough-hewn ropes, but with high-resolution thermal imaging, global positioning satellites, and topographical mapping software that can peel back the shadows of the canyon walls from thousands of miles away. In the quiet corners of the internet, and in the hushed conversations of hikers who meet on the North Rim, the map of the Grand Canyon has been rewritten with invisible ink. Every bend in the river, every limestone shelf, and every darkened alcove is scrutinized for any deviation from the natural order. They are looking for the straight lines of a doorway, the unnatural smoothing of a cavern entrance, or the telltale signs of ancient masonry hidden beneath the patina of 1,000,000 years of dust. As the years passed, the search for the elusive citadel shifted from the library archives to the rugged terrain of the canyon itself. Modern researchers, fueled by a mixture of skepticism and a deep-seated longing for discovery, have focused their efforts on a few specific locales that seem to echo the descriptions found in that century-old newspaper account. Point Imperial, the highest point on the North Rim, has become a focal point for many. From this towering vantage point, the canyon spreads out in a dizzying display of crimson and violet, a labyrinthine cathedral of stone where the scale of time is almost impossible to grasp. Researchers peer through high-powered lenses at the sheer cliffs across the chasm, looking for any sign of the marble canyon mentioned in the original story. They trace the contours of the rock, seeking a path that a lone man could have climbed, a ledge that might lead to a hidden world. The geography of the canyon is a fickle thing. What looks like a doorway from 5 miles away often dissolves into a mere trick of light and shadow upon closer inspection. And yet, the searchers persist, driven by the idea that somewhere, amidst the 65 million years of geological history, there is a small, human-shaped gap waiting to be rediscovered. Meanwhile, a peculiar atmosphere of tension surrounds certain areas of the Grand Canyon National Park. There are regions designated as high sensitivity zones where hiking is strictly prohibited, and the federal government maintains a firm grip on access. To the official mind, these are sites of ecological fragility or significant indigenous heritage, protected to ensure their preservation for future generations. But to those who follow the trail of the Kinkaid mystery, these restricted zones are the forbidden zones, the places where the truth is kept under lock and key. Rumors whisper of hikers who have wandered too close to these boundaries, only to be met by armed rangers or silent observers who seem to appear out of the very rock itself. These stories of government guards and motion sensors tucked into the cactus and scrub brush add a layer of modern intrigue to the ancient legend. It creates a psychological allure, a sense that the mystery is not just a matter of lost history, but of active concealment. The mind naturally gravitates toward the closed door. We find ourselves wondering why a specific stretch of desert is off limits, and in that wonder, the shadows of the Bronze Age outpost begin to lengthen and take shape once more. The allure of the forbidden is a powerful force in the human psyche, especially when it is set against a backdrop as majestic as the Grand Canyon. It is a landscape that feels as though it should hold secrets, a place where the sheer verticality of the world suggests layers of existence stacked one on top of the other. When a modern explorer looks at a map and sees a vast blank space labeled restricted area, the imagination does not fill that space with rare desert tortoises or fragile soil crusts. Instead, It fills it with the gold of an Egyptian pharaoh, the bronze spears of a lost legion, and the silent, mummified remains of a people who saw the stars differently than we do. This psychological phenomenon transforms the canyon from a geological wonder into a grand stage for a hidden drama. We want there to be a secret. We want to believe that even in an age of total surveillance and global connectivity, there are still places where the earth holds its breath and refuses to give up its ghosts. As these modern expeditions continue, they often find themselves grappling with the sheer physical brutality of the canyon. To move through this terrain is to move through deep time, where every step is a struggle against gravity and the elements. The heat can be a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders, while the silence of the inner gorge is so profound it seems to ring in the ears. Those who use drones to scout the cliffs often find their signals dropping out, swallowed by the immense mass of iron-rich rock, as if the canyon itself is rejecting the intrusion of the 21st century. There is a certain humility that comes with this kind of exploration. You realize very quickly that your GPS coordinates and your high-definition cameras are brittle tools when compared to the endurance of the stone. You are a fleeting shadow passing over a surface that has seen the rise and fall of countless species, the shifting of tectonic plates, and the slow, relentless carving of the river. In this environment, the line between fact and folklore begins to blur, much like the horizon line during a summer heat haze. A researcher might find a shard of pottery that looks out of place, or a series of markings on a wall that resemble an ancient script, and for a moment the heart beats faster. Is this the evidence? Is this the thread that will finally unravel the mystery? But then, the cold logic of stratigraphy intervenes. Stratigraphy is the study of rock layers and their sequence in time. It is the fundamental grammar of archaeology. When a find is analyzed within its context, it usually fits into the known narrative of the Ancestral Puebloans, or the Kohonina people who lived here centuries ago. Their history is rich and complex, filled with its own mysteries and triumphs, yet it often feels too domestic for those seeking the thrill of a transoceanic empire. And so, the modern explorer often looks past the real history of the canyon in search of a more fantastic one, drifting further into the labyrinth of the forbidden zone, guided by the flickering light of a story that refuses to die. The quest for Kinkaid's cave has become a pilgrimage of sorts, a way for people to connect with the idea of the unknown. Even if no bronze tablet is ever recovered, and no hidden city is ever revealed, the act of searching serves a purpose. It keeps the spirit of wonder alive in a world that often feels entirely mapped and explained. As the drones return to their landing pads and the hikers retreat to the comfort of the rim, the canyon remains indifferent to the scrutiny. It sits in a profound ancient stillness, a monument to deep time where the secrets of the past are buried under miles of rock and the weight of 1,000 centuries. We are left to wonder if the truth is something that can be found with a lens, or if it is something that can only be felt when the wind howls through the limestone fins, carrying the faint, echoing whispers of a history we have yet to truly understand. The stars emerge once more, pinning the sky to the edges of the plateau, while far below the river continues its work, cutting deeper into the heart of the world, unmindful of the small, curious creatures who walk along its rim, searching for the shadows of their own beginnings. A name is a fragile thing, a series of syllables that can drift away like desert dust or crystallize into a legend that refuses to dissolve, even after 100 years of scrutiny. In the quiet, flickering light of the digital age, researchers have begun a different kind of excavation, one that doesn't involve shovels or brushes, but rather the patient sifting of census records, yellowed birth certificates, and the digitized ghosts of 19th century ledgers. They are looking for the man at the center of the storm, the elusive G.E. Kinkaid. For decades, skeptics argued that he was a phantom, a convenient pseudonym invented by a bored journalist on a slow news day in Phoenix. And yet, as the glow of the computer screen illuminates the faces of those who seek him, a physical trail begins to emerge, faint as a deer path in the high brush, leading us toward a flesh-and-blood reality that is perhaps more complicated than the myth itself. As the years passed and the story of the Egyptian cave grew into a pillar of American folklore, the search for the real Kinkaid intensified. It was a pursuit of a man who seemed to exist only in the margins of history, a figure standing in the peripheral vision of the early 20th century. Eventually, a breakthrough occurred in the archives, a trace of a man named George Emerson Kinkaid. He was not a figment of imagination, but a real human being who walked the dusty streets of the American West, a man who breathed the dry mountain air and felt the grit of the river between his teeth. Records reveal a man who lived a life of rugged independence, a hunter, a trapper, and most importantly, a river runner. He was someone who knew the moods of the Colorado River long before it was dammed and tamed, someone who understood the way the water speaks when it is trapped between walls of ancient stone. This discovery brings a strange, quiet weight to the narrative. It is one thing to dismiss a story as a total fabrication, but it is quite another to find that the protagonist was real, a man with a documented history of traversing the very canyons where the mystery is said to reside. We find him in the census records of the early 1900s, a wanderer who moved through Idaho and Washington, often listing his occupation as a laborer or a hunter. There is a certain stillness in these documents, a sense of a man who did not seek the spotlight, yet whose name would eventually become synonymous with one of the greatest archaeological enigmas of the modern era. We can imagine him sitting by a small campfire, the smell of cedar smoke clinging to his heavy wool coat, perhaps unaware that a single interview given in 1909 would ripple outward through time, growing larger and more distorted with every passing decade. However, as we look closer at the life of the actual George Emerson Kinkaid, the sharp edges of the Gazette story begin to soften and blur. The newspaper described him as an explorer for the Smithsonian Institution, a man on a grand scientific mission backed by the weight of the nation's premier research body. But the historical record tells a humbler tale. There are no payroll records for him at the Smithsonian, no official correspondence, no field notes filed in the grand marble halls of Washington, D.C. The man found in the archives was a solitary figure, a rugged individualist who likely navigated the river for his own reasons, perhaps for the quiet, or for the thrill of the unknown, or simply because the horizon was there. The discrepancy between the explorer persona and the actual man creates a curious tension, a gap where the wind of speculation can howl. It is here, in this narrow space between fact and folklore, that we must consider the power of a single moment. In the early 20th century, the world was still vast and largely unmapped, a place where a man returning from the wilderness could walk into a newspaper office and tell a tale that seemed no more fantastic than the discovery of a new species or a lost city in the jungle. The interview Kinkaid gave to the Arizona Gazette was a lightning strike in a dry forest. It took the lived experience of a real river runner and draped it in the robes of high adventure and forbidden archaeology. We wonder if Kinkaid himself recognized the story when it appeared in print, or if he saw a stranger's face looking back at him from the columns of newsprint, a version of himself that had been polished and augmented to suit the public's hunger for the marvelous. The digital archive reveals that Kinkaid was indeed on the river in the autumn of 1908. He was part of a small party that made a trip from Green River, Wyoming, all the way down to Yuma, Arizona. This was no small feat. It was a grueling, dangerous journey through some of the most treacherous white water on the continent. He was a man of immense physical capability and intimate geographical knowledge. This reality lends a haunting credibility to his claims. If anyone were to stumble upon a hidden opening in the cliffs, a place where the shadows seemed deeper and the air more ancient, It would be a man like Kinkaid, someone who spent weeks drifting through the silence of the inner gorge, where the walls rise thousands of feet above the water like the ramparts of a forgotten world. And so, we are left with the image of a man who was both a witness and a catalyst. The real Kinkaid lived out his days in relative obscurity, eventually passing away in the 1960s, carrying whatever secrets he possessed into the quiet earth. He did not become a wealthy man from his discovery, nor did he spend his life campaigning for the truth of the Egyptian cave. He simply lived. This silence is perhaps the most intriguing part of his legacy. If he had invented the story for fame, he did not pursue it. If he had truly seen something that defied explanation, he seemed content to let the world argue about it without his further interference. The transformation of a real-life hunter into a legendary explorer is a process that mirrors the way the canyon itself was formed, layer by layer, through the steady accumulation of time and the erosive power of human imagination. A single interview, given in a moment of perhaps genuine excitement, or perhaps playful exaggeration, became the seed of a century of folklore. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of hard facts, but a tapestry woven from the threads of what people believed they saw and what they desperately wanted to be true. As we track his movements through old directories and dusty records, we feel the immense distance of the past. We see the limits of our own ability to truly know the heart of another human being. We have the dates of his travels and the locations of his residences, but we do not have his thoughts as he drifted past the great unconformity, that massive gap in the geological record where hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history have simply vanished, leaving a jagged line between the ancient schist and the younger sandstone. Perhaps Kinkaid felt that gap in time more keenly than most. Perhaps he looked at the empty spaces in the rock and felt that they ought to be filled with something, with kings, with gold, with the echoes of a civilization that understood the stars better than we ever will. The search for Kinkaid in the digital archive doesn't solve the mystery, but it grounds it in a heavy, earthly reality. It tells us that the story didn't emerge from a vacuum, but from the life of a man who truly knew the canyons. It forces us to ask why a real river runner would lend his name to such a wild tale, or if, in the profound loneliness of the deep gorge, the line between what is real and what is felt begins to shimmer and fade like a mirage on the desert floor. The river continues its long, slow descent toward the sea, carrying with it the silt of the mountains and the secrets of the men who once tried to master its currents. We are left on the bank, watching the water move past, searching for a name written in the ripples, a name that remains as elusive and enduring as the shadows in the stone. The archives can give us the man's shadow, but the man himself remains hidden in the deep time of the canyon, a figure forever walking just out of sight around the next bend of the river, where the light turns to gold and the whispers of the past are the only sound to be heard. The scratch of a fountain pen on yellowed newsprint eventually gave way to the steady, rhythmic hum of a printing press, and for many decades the story of the Egyptian tomb in the Grand Canyon lay dormant, a curious artifact of a more sensationalist era of journalism. But stories of this nature do not truly die. They merely wait for the right atmosphere to breathe again. As the mid-20th century turned toward the 1970s and 80s, a new kind of hunger began to stir in the collective imagination, a restless desire to find the extraordinary hidden beneath the mundane layers of modern life. It was during this period that the saga of Kinkaid and Jordan found a second life, resurrected within the pages of paranormal magazines and fringe archaeology journals that flourished in the dim light of grocery store magazine racks and specialized bookstores. These publications, often printed on cheap paper that smelled faintly of cedar and old ink, treated the 1909 Arizona Gazette article not as a forgotten hoax or a piece of frontier fiction, but as a suppressed piece of human history, a breadcrumb trail leading toward a truth that authorities were allegedly desperate to keep hidden. The transition from the dusty archives of the early 20th century to the glossy, speculative world of the 1970s was seamless, fueled by a growing skepticism toward established institutions. Writers during this era began to weave the Grand Canyon mystery into a larger tapestry of global anomalies, linking the supposed cavern to other legends of subterranean worlds and ancient migrations. It was a time of ancient astronauts and fingerprints of the gods, a time when the public was primed to believe that the history they had been taught in school was merely a thin veil draped over a much more complex and magical reality. The story began to circulate through the mail, passed from one enthusiast to another in photocopied newsletters, the text becoming slightly more blurred and ghost-like with each reproduction, as if the physical degradation of the paper mirrored the deepening mystery of the narrative itself. As the years passed and the 1990s arrived, the dawn of the Internet age acted as a catalyst, transforming what had been a niche curiosity into a viral phenomenon that could circle the globe in a matter of seconds. In the early days of message boards and primitive search engines, the 1909 article was transcribed and uploaded, stripped of its original context as a Sunday feature and presented as a raw report of a monumental discovery. Without the visual cues of the old newspaper, the surrounding advertisements for patent medicines, or the local gossip, the story took on a new, stark authority. It became a digital campfire story, whispered across the glowing screens of 1,000 monitors late at night. The anonymity of the web allowed the legend to grow unchecked, with new details being added by anonymous contributors who claimed to have seen the forbidden cave themselves, or who spoke of mysterious black helicopters patrolling the canyon rim to keep hikers away from the sacred site. This digital resurgence tapped into a profound human need for mystery in a world that was becoming increasingly mapped, measured, and monitored by satellites. As the blank spaces on the map began to disappear, the idea that a vast, treasure-filled necropolis could exist just out of sight, protected by the sheer scale of the canyon's vertical walls, offered a comforting sense of wonder. We find ourselves living in an age where the surface of Mars is photographed in high resolution, yet the deep folds of our own planet still seem to hold secrets that defy the logic of the modern world. The Internet didn't just preserve the story, it gave it a heartbeat, allowing it to evolve into a modern conspiracy theory that pitted the lone adventurer against the monolithic weight of the Smithsonian institution. The influence of this narrative reached far beyond the realm of conspiracy, bleeding into the very fabric of our popular culture and the way we visualize adventure. One can see the shadows of the Grand Canyon mystery stretching across the silver screen, informing the tropes of the Indiana Jones style of storytelling that dominated the late 20th century. The image of the rugged explorer, lit by the flickering orange glow of a torch as he steps into a chamber filled with golden idols and forgotten hieroglyphs, is a direct descendant of the Kinkaid myth. It is the archetypal dream of the lost world, a trope that suggests that somewhere, just beyond the reach of the nearest highway, lies a doorway into another time. This cinematic influence created a feedback loop. The more we saw these stories in films, the more plausible the original 1909 article seemed to become. We wanted it to be true because it felt like the movies we loved, a grand adventure where the stakes were nothing less than the rewriting of human history. Underneath the layers of speculation and the thrill of the chase, there lies a quiet, almost melancholy reflection on the limits of what we know. The story persists because it speaks to a fundamental tension in the human spirit, the conflict between our reliance on the scientific method and our ancient, primal love for the unknown. When we speak of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers that tells the story of the Earth's age, or radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint the moment a piece of wood was cut or a fire was lit, we are using the tools of the light. These tools are magnificent and precise, allowing us to peer back through thousands of years of deep time, yet the persistent legend of the canyon suggests that there are spaces where these tools cannot reach. Pockets of shadow where the younger dryas, that sudden, mysterious cooling of the earth nearly 13,000 years ago, might have left traces that we have yet to properly understand. The myth persists because it allows us to imagine that we are not the final masters of this landscape, but merely the latest in a long line of tenants. It invites us to consider that the Bronze Age, with its sprawling trade networks and burgeoning civilizations, might have had reaches far longer than the broken pottery and scattered flint arrowheads would suggest. The idea of an outpost in the desert, a sanctuary of Egyptian or Tibetan wisdom hidden in the red rock, is a manifestation of our desire to find connections across the vast gulfs of time and space. It is a way of saying that we are not alone in our awe of the canyon, that people from the other side of the world might have stood on these same precipices and felt the same overwhelming silence. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the story of the 1909 discovery remains a vibrant part of the canyon's folklore, a ghost story for the scientifically minded. It serves as a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts, but a living, breathing entity that changes depending on who is telling the story and what they hope to find. The archives may never yield a physical artifact from Kinkaid's cave, and the Smithsonian may never produce the crates of gold he described, but the story itself has become a kind of artifact, a treasure of the mind that we carry with us as we look out over the rim. The canyon does not care about our theories or our maps. It continues to carve its way through the crust of the earth, indifferent to the myths we weave around it. And yet, so long as the wind whistles through the narrow side canyons and the shadows play tricks on the eyes of the weary traveller, we will continue to look for the entrance to the forbidden chamber, searching for a past that is perhaps not lost, but merely waiting for the right moment to be remembered once again. The weight of these forgotten ages is heavy, like the heat of the midday sun on the canyon floor, and in that heat the line between what is real and what is imagined begins to shimmer and fade, leaving us with nothing but the enduring, patient mystery of the stone. A single sharp metallic ring once echoed against the limestone walls of the great gorge, or so the story tells us, a sound that shouldn't have existed in a landscape defined by stone and bone. In the original account from the Phoenix Gazette, the explorer Kinkaid described finding tools made of a copper so hard it rivaled the finest steel, a metallurgical marvel that seemed to defy the known progression of human technology. To understand the weight of such a claim, we must look at the science of the forge and the fire. For in the Bronze Age, the transition from soft copper to hardened alloys was a slow, agonizing process of trial and error that spanned thousands of years across the plains of Mesopotamia and the mountains of the Caucasus. If such tools truly rested within a hidden vault in the Grand Canyon, they would represent a mastery of heat and chemistry that the indigenous peoples of the Southwest, for all their architectural brilliance, simply had not pursued in that specific manner. Modern metallurgy tells us that copper can be hardened through a process called work hardening, striking the metal repeatedly while cold to compress its crystalline structure, or by alloying it with arsenic or tin to create bronze. But the Gazette article whispered of something more. A secret hardening process lost to the mists of time, one that allowed a copper blade to hold an edge against the very granite of the canyon. When we look at the stratigraphy, that layered record of time written in the earth like the pages of a dusty book, we find no slag heaps, no ancient kilns, and no chemical signatures of large-scale smelting in the region that would predate the arrival of European settlers. The silence of the earth is profound. It suggests that if these tools existed, They were either brought from a distance of many thousands of miles, or they were never there at all, leaving us to wonder if the hardened copper was merely a trick of the dim light or a storyteller's flourish intended to deepen the sense of wonder. As we move deeper into the cavern of the mind, we encounter the most striking claim of all, the presence of Egyptian hieroglyphs carved into the living rock, far from the life-giving waters of the Nile. To a linguist, writing is not merely a collection of symbols, but a living, breathing evolution of thought, a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to a specific culture and a specific moment in history. The hieroglyphs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms were part of a complex system of phonograms and logograms, a language that required a specialized class of scribes to maintain. For such a script to appear in the American Southwest, it would require more than a single wandering ship. It would require a sustained cultural presence, a school of learning, and a reason to carve those specific prayers into the silent stone. When experts analyze the probability of such an occurrence, they speak of the missing link of linguistic drift. Over centuries of isolation, languages change. They warp and bend under the influence of new environments and new neighbors. Yet the report claimed these symbols were recognizable, as if they had been plucked directly from a tomb in the Valley of the Kings and transplanted into the heart of Arizona. There is a certain poetic beauty in the idea, the notion that the ancient world was far more connected than our maps suggest, but the linguistic evidence remains as elusive as the wind. We find no pottery shards with matching inscriptions, no burial wrappings with woven spells, and no echoes of the Coptic or Demotic tongues in the rich oral traditions of the Hopi or the Zuni. The characters described by Kinkaid remain ghosts, shadows of a language that refuse to be captured by the light of modern translation. And so, we turn our gaze toward the great institutions of the East, specifically the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, District of Columbia, that vast repository of human knowledge, often called the nation's attic. In the story of the 1909 discovery, the Smithsonian is cast as the silent guardian of the find, the entity that sent Professor Jordan to oversee the excavation of the hidden city. But as the decades have turned into a century, the paper trail has grown thin, then vanished entirely. Within the Smithsonian's vast warehouses, where millions of artifacts are catalogued with meticulous care, there is no record of a Professor Jordan, no shipping manifests for crates of copper tools, and no shelf space dedicated to the Egyptian treasures of the Grand Canyon. The institution itself has maintained a consistent stance for over 100 years that no such expedition ever took place under their banner. To the seeker of mysteries, this absence of evidence is often seen as evidence of a cover-up, a deliberate attempt to suppress a truth that would shatter our understanding of human history. But to the archivist, it is simply a matter of provenance. Provenance is the lifeblood of archaeology. It is the documented history of an object from the moment it is pulled from the silt to the moment it is placed behind glass. Without a clear chain of custody, an artifact loses its voice. It becomes a beautiful orphan with no story to tell. The lack of a single physical specimen from Kinkaid's cave, not a bead, not a blade, not a scrap of papyrus, creates a void that no amount of speculation can quite fill. Meanwhile, we must consider the nature of the missing link in the Kinkaid story, the man himself. G.E. Kinkaid remains a figure of smoke and mirrors, a traveller who appears in the pages of a newspaper and then dissolves into the vastness of the American West. There are no birth records that perfectly align, no later journals, and no grave marked with his name that can be tied to the expedition. In the world of archaeology, the discoverer is as important as the discovery. Their reputation, their notes, and their methods provide the framework upon which the truth is built. When the discoverer vanishes, the story becomes a legend, and legends, while powerful, are difficult to measure with a carbon-14 test. Radiocarbon dating, That elegant method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint the age of organic matter requires something to burn, a piece of charcoal from a hearth, a fragment of a wooden beam, or the remains of a woven basket. In the forbidden chamber of the Grand Canyon, there is nothing left to test. We are left only with the words of a century-old article, printed on paper that is itself crumbling into dust. The mystery persists because it occupies the space between what we can prove and what we yearn to believe, a space where the limits of our knowledge are laid bare. As the years passed, the canyon has kept its secrets well, the red rock walls standing as silent sentinels over the secrets of the deep past. We are reminded of the vastness of deep time, the millions of years it took for the Colorado River to carve this path through the earth, and how small the window of human history truly is in comparison. In that scale of time, a city could rise and fall, and its stones could be ground back into sand, leaving nothing but a memory in the wind. We look for the hardened copper and the Egyptian signs, not just because we want to find gold or glory, but because we want to feel that we are part of a larger, more complex story, a human tapestry that stretches across oceans and eras in ways we are only beginning to imagine. The importance of physical evidence cannot be overstated, yet there is a certain quiet dignity in the unknown. If the Smithsonian has no record, and the tools have returned to the earth, the mystery remains pure, untainted by the clinical certainty of a museum display. It survives in the quiet moments of the night, when the mind wanders into the dark corners of the map, wondering if there are still places where the laws of history do not apply. The weight of the forgotten ages is not just in the objects we find, but in the questions we continue to ask. Questions that drift like wood smoke through the cedar trees on the canyon rim, dissipating into the starlight, leaving us to wonder what else might be sleeping beneath the stone, waiting for a dawn that may never come. Every grain of sand at the bottom of the Grand Canyon is a clock that has forgotten how to tick, a tiny fragment of a mountain that stood before the first breath of human consciousness was ever drawn. When we stand upon the rim, peering into that mile-deep silence, we are not merely looking at a geological feature. We are looking into a vessel for the human imagination, a space so vast and so indifferent to our presence that we feel a primal urge to fill it with our own stories. It is a natural instinct to stare into a void and populate it with ghosts, to imagine that the shadows dancing across the Vishnu schist at twilight are the silhouettes of a lost people, and that the wind whistling through the limestone breaks is the echo of a language we have long since forgotten how to speak. The canyon possesses a spiritual weight that is almost tactile, a gravity that pulls at the mind just as surely as it pulls at the body. For the indigenous peoples who have called this landscape home for thousands of years, the canyon is not a mystery to be solved, but a sacred emergence point, a living map of their origin and their destiny. Yet for those who arrived later, carrying the restless anxieties of a modern world, the canyon represented something different. It was a blank page on the edge of the map, a place where the rigid laws of the known world seemed to fray at the edges. We project our own histories onto these empty spaces because the alternative, that we are small, fleeting, and perhaps the only ones ever to witness this particular majesty, is a lonely thought to bear. We want to believe in the Egyptian vaults and the Tibetan shrines hidden in the red rock, because it would mean that the world is more interconnected and more mysterious than our textbooks allow. There is a profound beauty in the what if, a quiet joy in the act of wondering that serves a vital role in our modern society. Folklore and urban legends like the story of G.E. Kinkaid act as a form of modern mythology, providing a sense of enchantment in an age where every corner of the globe has been mapped by satellites and every secret seems to have been catalogued in a database. These stories allow us to maintain a relationship with the unknown. They remind us that despite our carbon dating and our ground-penetrating radar, the Earth still keeps its secrets well. When we entertain the possibility of a Bronze Age outpost in the heart of the American desert, we are not necessarily rejecting science. We are celebrating the scope of human potential and the enduring power of a well-told tale. We are acknowledging that the truth of a place is not always found in the stratigraphy, the study of rock layers that tells us the chronological history of the earth, but in the way a place makes us feel. And yet, there is a different kind of reverence to be found in the canyon's true, unembellished natural history. To look at a wall of stone and understand that it represents 2 billion years of patience is a spiritual experience in its own right. We do not need hidden gold or mummified kings to make the Grand Canyon significant. Its significance lies in its endurance. It has watched the rise and fall of countless species. It has seen the climate shift from tropical seas to frozen wastes, and it has remained carved by the steady, rhythmic persistence of the Colorado River. When we strip away the fantasies and the tall tales, we are left with a reality that is far more daunting and far more beautiful than any fiction. We find a landscape that demands respect, not for what it hides, but for what it openly reveals. The sheer, breathtaking scale of deep time and our own brief, flickering moment within it. As the years pass and the legend of the 1909 discovery fades further into the realm of campfire stories, the canyon itself continues its slow work of erosion and transformation. The caves that truly exist, those carved by water and time, inhabited by owls and ancient dust, remain silent, indifferent to our debates. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not whether a lost civilization once walked these depths, but why we so desperately need to believe they did. As we look out over the plateau one last time, the orange glow of the rocks deepening into purple, we realize that the canyon is a mirror. It reflects back to us our thirst for discovery, our fear of being alone in the deep reaches of history, and our eternal hope that there is still something left to find. The stone does not offer answers, only a quiet, steady presence that outlasts every theory and every dream we might cast into its depths. In the end, the Grand Canyon remains a cathedral of the natural world, a place where the boundaries between the physical and the metaphysical seem to blur in the heat haze of a summer afternoon. Whether we view it through the lens of archaeology, geology, or pure myth, it remains a testament to the power of the earth to inspire wonder. We leave the rim with our questions still drifting in the air, carried away by the thermal currents that lift the condors high above the abyss. The mystery of the outpost may never be solved to everyone's satisfaction, but perhaps that is for the best. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the shadow of the cliffs, protected by the silence of the ages, leaving us to walk back into the light of the present day, forever changed by the vastness we have glimpsed. The scent of dry sagebrush and cooling limestone rises from the depths, a subtle perfume that has drifted through these corridors of stone for millions of years. It is a fragrance that carries with it the weight of deep time, a reminder that while our stories are fleeting, the earth possesses a memory that is long and unforgiving. We find ourselves standing at the intersection of what is known and what is felt, looking out over a landscape that refuses to yield its secrets easily. The legend of the 1909 discovery, published in the Arizona Gazette, remains a curious artifact in its own right. A blend of turn-of-the-century yellow journalism, genuine archaeological yearning, and the undeniable magnetism of the American West. It is a story that exists in the periphery of our vision, like a shadow moving along the canyon floor that disappears the moment we try to look at it directly. As we reflect on the journey of G.E. Kinkaid and the elusive Professor Jordan, we must consider the nature of truth in a place as vast as the Grand Canyon. To some, the story is a clear fabrication, a tall tale designed to sell newspapers in a time when the world still felt large enough to hide lost empires. They point to the lack of physical evidence, the silence of the Smithsonian institution, and the sheer logistical impossibility of sustaining a massive Bronze Age colony in such a vertical, harsh environment. And yet, for others, the story resonates because it taps into a fundamental truth about human history, the realization that we are rarely the first to walk any path. We know that the canyon has been home to the Ancestral Puebloans, the Kohonina, and the Havasupai for centuries. We know that throughout the world, the record of human migration is constantly being rewritten by new discoveries in stratigraphy, that study of the layers of Earth that acts as a physical timeline of our presence on this planet. Perhaps the mystery of the Egyptian-style vault is not a matter of literal archaeology, but a manifestation of our collective wonder. We want the canyon to be more than just stone and water. We want it to be a library of the forgotten. The idea of a Bronze Age outpost, perhaps dating back to the era of the Younger Dryas, that period of abrupt climatic change nearly 13,000 years ago, offers a bridge between the mythic past and the geological present. Even if the tunnels described in the Gazette never existed, the feeling they evoke is real. It is the feeling of standing before something so much larger than oneself that the mind begins to fill the silence with the echoes of ancient footsteps. The river below, the Colorado, continues its patient work, carving through the Vishnu schist and the Zoroaster granite, rocks that were formed nearly 2 billion years ago. In the face of such staggering antiquity, the difference between 100 years and 3,000 years begins to blur. Skepticism is a necessary tool. It is the compass that keeps us from losing our way in the fog of speculation. We must demand evidence. We must respect the rigors of radiocarbon dating, that process of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic remains, and we must listen to the indigenous voices who have held the true history of this land in their oral traditions for generations. But wonder is the fuel that drives us to look in the first place. Without the dreamers and the seekers of lost cities, we might never have looked deep enough into the shadows to find the real wonders that do exist. The granaries perched high on impossible cliffs, the delicate pottery shards that tell of a vibrant, living culture, and the petroglyphs that still speak to the stars. The 1909 mystery serves as a sentinel at the gates of our imagination, reminding us that the world is still full of places where the map ends and the dreaming begins. As the light begins to change, the canyon undergoes its nightly transformation. The brilliant oranges and fiery reds of the afternoon soften into deep violets and bruised indigos. The heat of the day radiates back toward the sky, and a cool, steady breeze begins to pull through the side canyons, sounding like a long, slow intake of breath. The river, a silver thread a mile below, is lost to the darkness, though its roar remains. A constant, low-frequency vibration that one feels in the chest as much as hears in the ears. This is the hour when the myths feel most plausible. In this half-light, the shapes of the buttes and towers, named by early explorers after the gods of Egypt and India, seem to reclaim their titles. The Tower of Set, the Cheops Pyramid, and the Shiva Temple stand in silent assembly, watching the stars emerge one by one in the thin, clear air. We return to the peace of the rim, our footsteps light on the dusty trail. The questions we brought with us haven't been discarded, but they have perhaps been softened by the scale of the surroundings. Whether there were truly mummies wrapped in linen and tablets inscribed with strange glyphs hidden in these walls matters less in this moment than the fact that we are here to wonder about them. The mystery of the Grand Canyon is not something to be solved and filed away. It is a living presence, a vastness that humbles the ego and invites the soul to rest we have looked into the abyss, and the abyss has shared with us a small portion of its silence. It is a silence that does not feel empty, but rather full, heavy, with the weight of uncounted sunsets and the quiet persistence of life in the cracks of the world. The shadows have now filled the canyon completely, turning it into a sea of darkness beneath a canopy of brilliant light. The Milky Way stretches from horizon to horizon, a river of stars that mirrors the river of stone below. We are reminded that we are travelers in time as much as in space, moving through a brief flicker of light between two long eternities. The stories we tell, of lost civilizations, of hidden treasures, of explorers who vanished into the red rock, are the campfires we build to keep the vastness at bay, and as we drift towards sleep, we can let those fires burn low. The canyon will be here in the morning, unchanged by our theories and untouched by our doubts. It remains a sanctuary for the unknown, a place where the echoes of the past are allowed to drift on the wind, forever out of reach, but always within our hearts. The world grows quiet now. The distant cry of a nocturnal bird is the only sound that punctuates the stillness. The air is cool and still, and the ground beneath us is solid and ancient. We leave the mysteries where they belong, in the deep places, in the dark places, and in the quiet corners of our own minds. There is a profound comfort in knowing that some things are simply too big to be understood and too beautiful to be explained. We close our eyes, letting the image of the darkening rim fade into the soft grey of rest. The river continues its journey to the sea. The stars continue their slow rotation overhead, and the canyon walls stand as they always have, guardians of a history that is both ours and not ours. We are part of the story now, a single breath in the long, slow exhale of the earth. And so, we let go of the need for answers. We let go of the search for proof. We simply exist in the space that the mystery has created for us, a space of peace, of stillness, and of infinite depth. The echoes in the abyss grow faint, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the night. Sleep comes like the rising tide in a desert wash, gentle and inevitable, carrying us away from the rim and into the quiet currents of the dream. All is still, all is silent. The canyon is at rest, and so are we.